adverse effects and the side effects. How do they differ? The question is what causes them. So a typical side effect, and almost all the side effects when we talk about antibiotics, it's all skinny and not here. Oh, I have that effect on. Try getting a coffee, of course. I used to say to you, don't you guys have to use up all that money that you this time of year? Perfect time. No sugar. Latte. One single shot would be fine. No sugar. No additives. Regular food.
You want to teach us that?
No, I'm just trying to work the room for drinks. It's all right. I'm not going to give you anything.
We'll see.
I don't want it from you. You're blowing off a week anyway.
Yeah, but like I have 2 weeks when I get back.
Yeah, please. Where was I? Oh, we did half-life. Oh, I'm losing my place. Adverse effects. So most of the adverse effects, GI, gastrointestinal, constipation, diarrhea, nausea, vomiting, rectal bleeding, you name it. They're most of the time antibiotics. The principal site for adverse effects is the GI tract. It can irritate the tissues. It can be problems with absorption. It can damage the lining that's there. All of those are possible. Those are not allergies. Allergies, we typically see rash, we see fever, we see swelling, we see difficulty in breathing because they're very inflammatory in nature. And the reason is they're due specifically to the unusual or excessive activation of your immune system. So by this time in anatomy and physiology, most of you have you've gotten your way into the immune system, so you know what that's all about. There's a lot of chemicals that are released, and that's what and most of the time it manifests itself. Hives, swelling, rash, even difficulty breathing all the way down to anaphylactic shock. They both could be deadly. I mean, somebody could, an older person or a baby could die from prolonged vomiting and diarrhea. In fact, it happens with some degree of regularity, unfortunately. So you can't paint with a broad brush. One's not necessarily worse than the other. Okay. The big problem again with antibiotics, what they do is they clobber the normal bacteria, and that allows other bacteria to overgrow, like C. diff. That's an overgrowth that occurs. Damages the lining, kills the normal occupants. Now this endospore former, which is normally dormant and just kind of hanging out there, not doing anything, gets to flourish because now that all the nutrients are available to the other ones that are destroyed. Think of it this way. Getting there. The cell wall antibiotics again that you're going to have to know: penicillins, cephalosporins, vancomycin. Anything else really doesn't work that way. Bacitracin is in that category, but I'm not going to ask you about that.
What was the second one?
Penicillins, cephalosporins. Those are the Keflex, C-chlor. That's the category that you really should be very familiar with. What the penicillins and cephalosporins have in common, they have the same chemical nucleus. It's called a beta-lactam ring. That ring is what sort of interposes itself in the peptidoglycan and doesn't allow it to form. That's how it does their damage. And since nearly every bacteria has a certain amount of peptidoglycan, it's much more effective against gram-positives than gram-negatives because they have a much more distinctive cell wall. Bacteria, particularly staphylococcal organisms, make something called penicillinase that attacks that structure. There are other bacteria that make something similar that's not quite the same but works in the same area called beta-lactamases. So these are both enzymes that bacteria manufacture to resist a variety of different penicillins. It's because of that we have kept tinkering with penicillins, taking like ampicillin to make it more likely to affect gram-negatives. We're making the methicillin family, which can combat some of those penicillinases. But what happens inevitably is that bacteria keep changing, mutating, and that's where MRSA has come, because it makes an enzyme that can deactivate even the methicillin, which is designed to combat the penicillins. So that's where we are pretty much now, where every time we have an antibiotic that we think we can use, we tend to overuse it, we use it excessively, and at that point the bacteria wise up to it and make an enzyme or develop some mechanism for resistance, either by mutation or acquisition. There's a lot of ways that we can do that. We particularly see that in staphylococcal organisms, and that's really the major source of our infections that are of great concern about it. Beta-lactamases are not as difficult to deal with because we have a medication called clavulanic acid. Take clavulanic acid, it can interfere with beta-lactamases. So by taking the clavulanic acid and mixing it, and they've tried this with a lot of different antibiotics, particularly by mixing it with amoxicillin, they came up with an agent that has a great deal of usage called augmentin. Because the amoxicillin is a pretty versatile penicillin agent that affects both gram-positives and gram-negatives, staphylococcal organisms, some, not MRSA, lots of streptococcal organisms, easy to kill gram-negatives. And what happens, the clavulanic acid, what it does is it deactivates the beta-lactamase. So while it basically is taking the interference, like a block football game, it's taking out the interference, it would be tackling, which is the beta-lactamase, and it allows the amoxicillin to do what it has to do. Make sense? Yeah.
What does it mean right here?
This part here?
No, the bottom.
Augmentin.
Yeah. No.
Did you ever hear of augmentin?
I was trying to keep up with typing, so I didn't even hear what
I
you
got
said. I was just trying to read it.
A-U-G-M-E-N-T-I-N
Thank you.
M-O-U-S. I told you, did you hear what's happening in the Magic Kingdom?
No, what's happening?
Pat downs. So if you're going to be in Florida, so if you guys go over to Orlando, watch out.
What do you think I'm gonna do?
Who knows? You could be hiding something.
What am I hiding?
I don't know.
I'm a small
Be
girl.
careful.
I can't hide it really anywhere. In my what? Your hair. In my hair.
I can't do it. I can't demonstrate it.
I'm not even going there.
Sure.
I'm not. I'm far from there.
Yo,
Huh?
you going?
No, I'm not. I'd like to, but I'm not.
One of my favorite comedians, he does a gangsta Mickey.
I think he told us this
I told
one.
you that was hysterical.
I think he told us this one.
He wants to do the pat down on one of the princesses. Mickey's sort of a witch. So it'd be dirty.
I love it.
Terrible.
That's great.
No. It's a little, I think it's a little crude. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be offensive. Sometimes it's humorous. Nevertheless, the biocephalosporins, a very good, useful combination. They are useful because they have, they're broader in spectrum. So they touch more gram-negatives than this. They have both gram-positives and gram-negatives. They're just as inexpensive, they're available generically, and they're less likely to be deactivated again by those beta-lactamases. That's why cephalosporins, nearly half the antibiotic prescriptions written in this country are for cephalosporins. That's why you need to know so much about it, because there's something that you folks, if you're going to a medical field, will become acquainted with. With regard to allergies, unfortunately, there's a lot of people who are allergic to cephalosporins, and about 10% of those are allergic to penicillin, and about 10% of those are also allergic to cephalosporins. Therefore, there are drugs of choice to use for those allergies. The drug of choice is in the family of macrolides, M-A-C-R-O-L-I-D-E-S. That happens to be erythromycin. Okay. It's erythromycin. What we use today is not regular erythromycin because you have a lot of GI problems. We use sort of a souped up, you only have to take it for a short period of time version we all call the Z-Pack, whose formal name is azithromycin. This is a generic name. Well, many of you will have to know both. Really, from a perspective, generic names are the most are more important than trade names. Depends on where you train and who you train. There are other agents that are used a lot. There are aminoglycosides, those streptomycin, kanamycin, gentamicin, tobramycin. Gentamicin is used a lot for a problem infection called Pseudomonas. The problem is it has a lot of toxicity to your hearing and particularly so to your kidneys, so you should be aware of it. The same way tetracyclines, which are useful as, again, an alternative for people who are allergic to penicillin, but you can't use it in small children because it permanently will discolor their teeth. But erythromycins and tetracyclines are useful drugs. They are in the category of protein. So other than cell wall drugs, most of the other ones are protein synthesis drugs. The Cipro is a little bit different. It works on DNA, it doesn't allow it to unwind, so it can't replicate. And the one that you really do need to know are what we call combination sulfa drugs. They work on a pathway that only bacteria have called folic acid. So they inhibit that pathway. There are two drugs that work together. One's called trimethoprim, the other one's called sulfamethoxazole. You know them as Bactrim or Septrim. They typically are used for urinary tract infections because they're relatively mild and easy to tolerate, but we found out that they work very well against MRSA, particularly the community-acquired type of MRSA. Hospital MRSA is a big, you need a big one. If one of you would get one here from, I'm not implicating the fitness center, but typically those are areas where you might acquire something like that, and that was the place where you scraped you fell on something you're working out on a mat, you had a brush burn that got that kind of an infection, which is considerably can happen, despite everybody's best efforts. Typically that's what they would prescribe to you unless you were allergic to it. And like anything else, there can be allergies to it. The big players we see with resistance a lot, MRSA, which is harbored in your nose, is methicillin-resistant staphylococcus aureus. And in your GI tract, before even C. diff reared its ugly head, they used a lot of vancomycin for gastrointestinal infections because it works in the stomach. It's not absorbed particularly well from the GI tract, but it works okay in it. So you got a thing called VRE. It's in the PowerPoint sequence and in the textbook. It stands for vancomycin-resistant enterococcus. Enterococcus faecalis, which is kind of in the strep family, is a royal pain in the neck to find antibiotics. And because when people have diarrhea, it gets on their wounds, it's really ugly. I mean, I've had people with staph E. coli and enterococcus on the same wound in a big old sort of bed sore. And it's like, you're just in trouble. Things go down the bone, it's a mess. Let's see. Drugs of choice. For C. diff, we use a very interesting drug that sort of overlaps both, because it's used as an antibiotic and an antiprotozoan. It's called metronidazole. You'll hear about it a lot. It's called Flagyl, F-L-A-G-Y-L. It works on bacteria and protozoans because they're certain strains of bacteria and most protozoans are anaerobic in nature. They don't do well with oxygen. It's hard to find antibiotics for anaerobic infections. Flagyl has been around a long time. It's pretty well understood, other than a pretty bad headache for some people. That's about the extent of the side effect. It doesn't taste good. And it's very useful for protozoan infections, which you see a lot of with contaminated water. And you'll see when we get to the urinary tract, there's a couple of urinary tract problems, one of which is a sexually transmitted disease, which is a protozoan called Trichomonas vaginalis. Let's see. Antivirals. anti-vomit